Aurelia Sterling didn't know the Alpha King's promises were woven from ash. She didn't know the Grand Summit, hailed across the territories as the dawn of a new era of peace, was merely a stage built for her execution. And she definitely didn't know that the golden thread of their mate bond, the ancient magic that had anchored her soul to this ancient territory for 7 years, was about to become a noose. All she knew was the sudden, suffocating drop in the temperature of the great cathedral. The vaulted ceilings of the ancient stone structure trapped the heat of thousands of lichen nobles. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced wine, and the heavy musk of predatory anticipation. Banners of silver and forest green hung from the rafters, proudly displaying the crest of the ruling monarch. On the raised day, seated upon a throne carved from petrified ironwood, Aurelia maintained her flawless posture. She wore a gown of midnight blue, but it was her hair that commanded the room's absolute reverence. Cascading down her back and spilling over the armrests of her throne, her hair was a river of liquid silver. It was the physical manifestation of her sacred bond to the pack, glowing with the faint ethereal light of the divine deity's blessing. For 7 years, that light had kept the kingdom fertile, the warriors strong, and the borders impenetrable. The bonding ceremony was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, as the massive timber portals of the cathedral groaned open to admit the final guest of the evening, Aurelia felt a phantom blade press against the base of her throat. Valerius Silverwood rose from the throne beside her. He was a man carved from marble and ambition, possessing shoulders broad enough to carry an empire, and eyes the color of a gathering storm. His scent, a familiar blend of pine and ozone, flared with a sudden, jagged spike of dominance that made the lesser alphas in the room bare their throats in submission. But as he stepped to the edge of the dais, he did not reach for Aurelia's hand. He did not project the protective warmth of a mate. The crowd parted. Walking down the central aisle, wrapped in a cloak of crimson velvet that insulted the solemnity of the cathedral, was Cynthia Thorne. Aurelia's breath hitched. Though her face remained an impassive mask of porcelain, Cynthia was not a Luna. She possessed no earth magic, no spiritual connection to the ancestral roots of this domain. She was a social climber, a manipulator who masked the scent of deceit behind heavy layers of imported rosewater. Yet, as the woman approached the steps of the dais, Valerius descended to meet her. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles with a tenderness that sent a violent, physical tremor through the golden thread, connecting his soul to his true mate. "Lords and ladies of our great kingdom," Valerius's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone walls. "We stand at the precipice of a new age, an age that requires modern strength, expanded alliances, and a vision that looks beyond the old ways." A hollow ache bloomed in the center of Aurelia's chest. The temperature around her throne seemed to plummet, freezing the spiced wine in the goblets of the nearest nobles. The ambient light radiating from her silver hair dimmed, a biological reaction to the profound rejection radiating from her alpha. "For years the Lunas has served as the spiritual anchor of our lands," Valerius continued, finally casting a glance back at Aurelia. His storm-grey eyes were entirely devoid of guilt. They were calculating, cold, but the burdens of secular ruling, of leading our armies and expanding our economy, require a different kind of partnership. Therefore, by my absolute right as Alpha King, I decree the elevation of Cynthia Thorne. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen from the cathedral. High Priest Gideon Vance, standing near the altar in his ceremonial white robes, stiffened. His knuckles turned white as he gripped his wooden staff. Valerius turned back to the crowd, raising Cynthia's hand high. "From this night forward, Cynthia shall be recognized as the sovereign consort. She will share my bed, my counsel, and hold equal ruling rights to the Luna in all matters of state." The word thundered through their bond like a war drum, shattering the quiet stability of Aurelia's mind. The impact was entirely physical. Deep within her ribcage, the golden thread of their mate bond violently frayed, snapping and curling back on itself like burning wire. A searing, white-hot agony exploded behind her sternum. Her inner wolf slammed against the bars of her consciousness, howling in pure, unadulterated agony at the ultimate betrayal. Valerius was not discarding her completely. He was caging her. He intended to keep her as a spiritual battery to power his reign and maintain the magical barriers of the realm, while giving all the power, love, and secular authority to his mistress. Silence, absolute, crushing silence descended upon the thousands of gathered lichens. Aurelia did not weep. She didn't know the Alpha King could see through glamours of political necessity to reveal his true, corrupted heart, but she would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. While the physical pain threatened to tear her organs apart, her pride remained an unbreakable fortress. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. A servant hurried forward, carrying a velvet cushion. Resting upon it was the sovereign consort crown. It was an offensive, garish thing, heavy with gold and glittering emeralds, entirely lacking the sacred moonstones that adorned a true lunar's circlet. On the 7th day from now, Valerius announced, his voice dropping to a gravelly command that demanded absolute obedience. We shall hold the coronation, and to signify the unity of our new ruling triad, Luna Aurelia herself will place the crown upon the sovereign consort's head. Cynthia looked up at the throne, a sickeningly sweet smile stretching across her painted lips. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She expected the silver-haired woman to break. The entire court expected the humiliated mate to scream, to shift into her wolf form, or to fall to her knees and beg for her husband's mercy, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. Aurelia rose. The simple movement was incredibly fluid, hiding the fact that her legs felt like lead and her lungs were burning for oxygen. The faint, silvery glow of her hair trailed against the stone floor, a stark reminder of the divine power the king was taking for granted. She stepped down from the throne, closing the distance until she stood directly before her mate and his mistress. Valerius towered over her, his jaw set, bracing for a physical attack or a hysterical outburst. Instead, Aurelia lowered her eyes. She gripped the heavy midnight blue fabric of her skirts and sank into a perfect, flawless curtsy. It was a gesture of absolute, chilling compliance. "As my king commands," she whispered. Her voice was steady, devoid of any tremble, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. She did not look at Cynthia. She did not look at the crown. Turning on her heel, the Luna walked down the central aisle of the great cathedral. The crowd parted frantically, terrified to even brush against the freezing aura of her sorrow. With every step she took away from Valerius, the ambient temperature in the room continued to drop until frost began to trace the edges of the stained glass windows. She left the king standing as in the center of his supposed triumph, suddenly looking very small beneath the looming shadows of the vaulted ceiling. The solid wooden gates closed behind her with a sound like the end of the world, and only then, in the empty freezing corridor where no one could see, did her hands begin to shake. 2 days passed in agonizing, forced isolation. Aurelia was effectively a prisoner in her own chambers. 4 elite royal guards stood outside her heavy doors, a polite enforcement of her new reality. She was allowed no visitors, not even her handmaidens. Valerius had sent orders that the Luna was to rest and prepare her spirit for the upcoming coronation. The betrayal had settled into her bones like a terminal illness. Her chambers, once a sanctuary filled with the scent of cedar and the warmth of a shared life, now felt like a mausoleum. She had systematically stripped the bed of its sheets, throwing the silks that smelled of pine and ozone into the burning hearth. She refused to sleep. She refused to eat the rich meals left at her door. Instead, she sat on the freezing stone balcony, letting the harsh winter winds whip across her face. The cold was a relief. I would rather burn with the truth than freeze inside a lie, she thought, watching the distant darkened tree line of the exiled forest. Valerius's plan was brutally clear. The laws of the Lycan Empire dictated that a fated mate bond could not be dissolved by a simple decree of divorce. It was tied to the blood, the soul, and the magic of the land itself. If he banished her, the pack would lose its connection to the celestial mother. The crops would fail, the warriors would lose their accelerated healing. He needed her to stay, to sit quietly in the shadows and bleed her spiritual energy into the earth, while Cynthia paraded around with the emerald crown. Not used, not owned, chosen. That was what a mate was supposed to be. As the midnight bells of the capital tolled, signaling the deepest hour of the night, Aurelia stood up from the balcony floor. Her silver hair whipped wildly in the wind. She was not a battery. She was a sovereign entity of the earth, and she would not allow her sacred connection to be weaponized for the glory of a usurper. There had to be a way to break the unbreakable. Wrapped in a dark woolen cloak that hid the radiant glow of her hair, Aurelia moved to the far wall of her bedchamber. Behind a heavy tapestry depicting the founding of the Silverwood realm lay a narrow, forgotten servant's passage. It was a secret known only to the reigning Lunas, passed down through generations. Pushing the heavy stone block aside, she slipped into the suffocating darkness of the walls, navigating the steep, spiraling steps by touch alone. Her descent took her far beneath the great cathedral, past the royal crypts, and into the restricted catacombs of the high priestesses. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of old magic, dry parchment, and undisturbed dust. The ambient glow of her hair illuminated the damp stone walls, casting long, eerie shadows across rows of ancient, iron-bound bookshelves. Aurelia moved with frantic precision. She ignored the political histories and the lineage records, driving herself deep into the section detailing the spiritual mechanics of the mate bond. She pulled heavy tomes from the shelves, her eyes scanning the faded, archaic script. Hours bled away. Her fingers grew black with dust and age, but she did not stop. She read of blood seals, of fatal poisons, of temporary severances caused by immense physical trauma. None of it was enough. She needed a permanent eradication of the golden thread. Finally, near the bottom of a rotted wooden chest, her fingers brushed against a scroll bound in tarnished silver wire. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. As she unrolled it, the air in the small chamber seemed to grow suddenly dense, pressing against her eardrums. It was the rite of severance. Aurelia's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes devoured the text. It was a ritual so ancient, so taboo, that it had been officially erased from the modern teachings of the priesthood. The rite detailed the terrifying truth of the Luna's anatomy. The silver-white hair of a true magically gifted Luna was not merely a genetic trait. It was the physical root system of the pack bond. Every strand acted as a conduit, channeling the divine energy of the lunar deity into the earth and into the soul of the reigning lord. The text was explicit. To sever the bond without the release of death, the Luna must willingly sacrifice the conduit. She must sever the crown of her divinity before the eyes of the pack. The pain of the physical disconnection will mirror the agony of a torn soul. Once the silver falls, the thread is broken. The Alpha will be stripped of the Luna's divine mandate, and his power shall be halved. Aurelia read the passage 3 times, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was not a legal loophole, it was a spiritual amputation. If she did this, she would lose her status, her home, and a part of her own magical essence. She would experience the physical sensation of having her soul ripped out through her scalp. But she would be free, and Valerius would lose the very foundation of his arrogant reign. Her eyes scanned further down the brittle parchment, looking for the tools required for the ritual. Ordinary steel could not cut the physical manifestation of a divine bond. The sacrifice must be made with the ancestral silver shears, forged in the original moonlight by the first high priestess. Only sacred silver can cut the sacred thread. Aurelia closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the cold stone wall of the archives. The sacred lunar blades, she had seen them only once, during her own bonding ceremony 7 years ago. They were kept under the strictest guard, entrusted only to the highest spiritual authority in the realm. They were in the possession of High Priest Gideon Vance. An image of the grim, unyielding priest flashed in her mind. During the summit, while the rest of the court had buzzed with political excitement over Cynthia's elevation, Gideon had stood like a statue of silent fury. He was a man who served the moon goddess above the Alpha King. He despised Valerius's blatant disrespect for the sacred laws. If there was one man in the entire nation who would risk execution to help her execute a taboo ritual, it was Gideon. Aurelia carefully rolled the scroll back up, securing the tarnished silver wire. She tucked the ancient document deep into the inner pocket of her woolen cloak. The hollow ache in her chest, the persistent burning of the frayed golden thread, suddenly felt different. It was no longer the agonizing sting of victimhood. It was the heat of a forging fire. She looked down at the river of silver-white hair spilling over her shoulders, pooling on the dusty floor of the catacombs. For her entire life, she had been defined by it. It was her beauty, her status, her burden. Valerius believed he owned it. He believed he could parade his mistress in front of the kingdom, secure in the knowledge that Aurelia's hair would forever anchor his throne to the earth. He was wrong. Aurelia stood up, dusting the ancient dirt from her knees. The numbness that had paralyzed her since the announcement in the great cathedral evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. She would not wait quietly in her chambers. She would not be the silent, suffering martyr of the Pax Domain. She would attend the coronation on the 7th day. She would stand before the entire gathered kingdom, before Valerius and his grinning consort, but she would not be holding a crown of emeralds. With a steady, silent breath, Aurelia stepped out of the archives and disappeared back into the darkness of the secret passage, preparing to burn the kingdom to the ground. Dawn broke over the Silverwood capital on the morning of the 7th day, bleeding a pale, bruised purple light through the frost-rimed windows of the royal chambers. Inside the vaulted stone room, the air was as brittle as spun glass. Aurelia stood before the towering vanity mirror, her reflection an ethereal ghost against the dark, heavy tapestries of the walls. For 5 days she had eaten nothing, she had barely slept. The golden thread of her mate bond, once a source of radiant warmth that pulsed in time with the heartbeat of her alpha, had necrotized into a jagged, burning wire lodged deep within her chest. Every time Valerius touched Cynthia elsewhere in the sprawling citadel, the thread twitched, sending waves of sickening, physical cold through Aurelia's veins. It was a suffocating, parasitic ache, an agonizing reminder of the eternity she had been promised, and the profound betrayal that had replaced it. She stared at the river of silver-white hair cascading over her shoulders and tumbling down to her waist. It was the physical conduit of her divine mandate, the literal roots of her spiritual connection to the land and to the pack. It glowed with a faint, intrinsic luminescence, casting a halo of moonlight around her pale face, a stark contrast to the hollow shadows beneath her striking tempest-hued gaze. Today Valerius expected her to use the authority of this sacred hair to validate his ultimate betrayal. He expected her to bow her head, swallow her pride, and place the sovereign consort crown upon the head of a usurper. He expected the Luna of the reigning dynasty to become a compliant ornament in her own home, endorsing her own humiliation for the sake of political stability and his toxic infatuation. I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen, she thought, the vow settling in her marrow like hardened steel. A heavy, rhythmic knock echoed against the iron-bound oak doors of her chambers. The 4 elite royal guards stationed outside stepped aside, the clanking of their armor signaling the arrival of the only visitor permitted to see the Luna before the ceremony. The heavy door groaned open, admitting a rush of stale corridor air, followed immediately by the sharp, astringent scent of burning mire and ancient parchment. High Priest Gideon stepped into the room. He was a formidable figure, tall and unyielding, clad in the layered white and silver vestments of his sacred office. His face was a landscape of deep lines, carved by years of strict adherence to the laws of the sacred creator. He carried his heavy wooden staff in one hand, the silver crescent moon at its peak, catching the dim light of the dawn, the heavy door shut behind him, sealing them in absolute privacy. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, layered with the unspoken tension of a kingdom balancing on the edge of a blade. Gideon's gaze swept over her, taking in the pristine, unadorned white silk of her gown, the traditional garment of mourning and holy rites, completely devoid of the midnight blue crest of the royal house. Aurelia turned away from the mirror. Her face was a mask of cold porcelain, devoid of the weeping despair. The entire court assumed she was suffering in private. She did not curtsy. She did not offer a formal greeting. Instead, she reached into the hidden pocket of her dark woolen cloak, which hung over the back of a nearby chair, and withdrew the brittle parchment bound in tarnished silver wire. She extended her hand. The rite of severance scroll sat upon her open palm like a dormant explosive. Gideon's eyes dropped to the object. The high priest's breath hitched a sharp, involuntary intake of air that betrayed his shock. He did not need to unroll the parchment to know what it was, the archaic seal, the specific weave of the silver wire, the palpable, suffocating aura of forbidden magic radiating from the ancient document. He recognized it instantly. It was the taboo ritual, the single most destructive piece of theology hidden beneath the great cathedral. "You went into the restricted catacombs," Gideon rasped, his voice dropping to a harsh, dangerous whisper. He stepped closer, his storm-grey eyes searching her face for any sign of hesitation. "Luna, do you understand what it is you are holding? Do you comprehend the cataclysm this parchment demands?" "I understand that a bond corrupted by deceit is a poison to the earth," Aurelia replied, her voice eerily steady. She did not withdraw her hand. "The Alpha King believes he can cage my spirit to anchor his reign while elevating his mistress to my equal. He believes the laws of our ancestors are merely suggestions he can override with a royal decree. He thinks the divine magic in my blood can be chained and harvested by a man who no longer respects its source. He is wrong." The older man stared at the scroll, the muscles in his jaw clenching tight. "The severance is not a legal divorce, Aurelia. It is a physical amputation of the soul. Your hair is the conduit of the moon goddess's blessing. To sever it willingly is to rip the golden thread out of your own chest by the roots. The physical agony will be unimaginable. It has not been attempted in 4 centuries, because the shock alone is enough to stop a lichen's heart." "My heart stopped beating for him 5 nights ago," the silver-haired woman stated, her tone entirely devoid of melodrama. It was a simple, factual declaration of death. "I am not asking for your permission, High Priest Gideon. I am asking for the instrument of my liberation." The silence in the room stretched until it felt as though the stone walls were vibrating with the pressure. Gideon looked at the young woman standing before him. He saw the dark hollows beneath her eyes, the unnatural pallor of her skin, and the terrifying absolute conviction in her posture. She was a true sovereign, possessing a dignity that Valeria Silverwood could never comprehend. Slowly, deliberately, the priest reached into the deep, concealed pockets of his ceremonial robes. When he brought his hand out, a sudden, heavy chill flooded the chamber. Held securely in his weathered grip were the mythic silver blades. They were an artifact of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. Forged by the first high priestess under the light of a blood moon, the shears were massive, heavy, and glinting with a lethal, iridescent sheen. The blades were etched with ancient, forgotten runes that pulsed with a faint, predatory blue light. They were designed for one purpose only, to cut the sacred, metaphysical bonds of the divine. "If you do this before the gathered kingdom," Gideon said, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment, as he offered the sacred artifact to her, "you will strip the Alpha King of half his power. The realm's magical barriers will decay. The land will reject his authority. He will hunt you to the ends of the earth for what you take from him today." Aurelia reached out. Her slender fingers closed around the cold, textured handles of the rune-etched weapon. A shock of pure static electricity shot up her arm, settling deep in her chest. It was the sensation of raw, unadulterated power, recognizing its true master. "Let him try," she breathed, sliding the heavy weapon into a hidden sheath, sewn deep within the folds of her pristine, unadorned white gown. The moon goddess protects those who refuse to bow to false idols. Gideon bowed his head, a gesture of profound, ultimate respect. "Then may the goddess guide your hand, sovereign." 2 hours later, the grand bells of the capital began to toll, a deafening, rhythmic booming that vibrated through the cobblestone streets and echoed off the towering spires of the great cathedral. The entire nobility of the empire, alongside thousands of common citizens, had packed into the massive stone structure. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the suffocating scent of roasted meats, excessive floral perfumes, and the collective, sweaty anticipation of a political spectacle. Whispers hissed through the pews like a nest of vipers, speculating on whether the Luna would weep, beg, or simply surrender her dignity in silence. At the far end of the central aisle, elevated upon a massive dais of polished black marble, stood Valerius. He wore the ceremonial armor of the Alpha King, a breathtaking ensemble of silver and midnight leather that accentuated the sheer, imposing breadth of his shoulders. His storm-grey eyes scanned the crowd with a predatory arrogance. Beside him, radiating a cloying, artificial sweetness that masked a hollow core, stood Cynthia Thorne. She was draped in crimson velvet, her posture oozing the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had finally conquered the unassailable peak of the kingdom. Sitting upon a plush velvet cushion upon a golden pedestal between them was the ceremonial consort's diadem. It caught the light of the massive chandeliers, a garish display of emeralds and gold that lacked any true spiritual resonance. The tolling of the bells abruptly ceased. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral groaned open, swinging inward with a sound that demanded absolute attention. The murmuring of the thousands of lichens died instantly. A profound, unnatural quiet swept through the cavernous space, replacing the stifling heat with a sudden, bone-deep chill. Aurelia stepped across the threshold. She did not wear the midnight blue of the royal house. She wore a gown of pure, blinding white silk, devoid of any crest, jewel, or insignia. It was the color of a winter moon, stark and uncompromising, her silver-white hair, the radiant crown of her divine connection, cascaded down her back like a waterfall of liquid light, catching the ambient magic of the room and illuminating the space around her. She was a vision of untamed, sacred sovereignty, completely untethered from the political machinations of the court. She began her walk down the central aisle. Every step was measured, silent, and deliberate. The crowd parted frantically, pressing themselves against the wooden pews to avoid touching her. The physical manifestation of her aura was overwhelming. With every yard she advanced, the temperature in the cathedral plummeted. The breath of the nobles began to plume in the air as white mist. Frost began to spiderweb across the edges of the massive stained glass windows, obscuring the morning light and casting a long, cold shadow over the congregation. Valerius watched her approach. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering furiously in his cheek. He had expected her to arrive broken, her eyes red from weeping, her posture submissive. He had anticipated a display of quiet compliance, a tragic but necessary sacrifice to secure his desires without destabilizing the realm. Instead, she moved with the terrifying grace of an executioner ascending the scaffold. A prickle of genuine, unexplainable unease scratched at the back of his mind, a primal warning from his wolf, but his towering arrogance quickly crushed it down. She was bound to him. The golden thread demanded her obedience. Aurelia reached the base of the dais. She stopped, her eyes lifting to meet her mates. There was no love in her gaze. There was no sorrow. There was only a vast, glacial emptiness that made the Alpha King's pulse inexplicably falter. The temperature in the immediate vicinity of the dais dropped so drastically that a thin layer of hoarfrost began to crystallize upon the marble steps. Luna Aurelia, Valerius's voice boomed across the silent cathedral, carrying the heavy, commanding resonance of his alpha tone. It was a sound designed to force submission into the bones of anyone who heard it. You stand before the pack on this dawn of a new era. We have gathered to formalize the unity of our strength. He gestured broadly to the woman standing beside him. Cynthia tilted her chin up, offering the true Luna a smile laced with absolute venomous pity. It was the smile of a thief who had stolen a treasure she could never truly understand, flaunting her prize before its rightful owner. By the ancient rights of the Alpha, the king continued, his voice ringing off the stone arches, projecting a false sense of absolute control. I have decreed the elevation of Cynthia Thorne to sovereign consort. She shall stand as my equal in the secular ruling of these lands. To seal this bond before the eyes of the moon goddess, I command you, my Luna, to take up the crown and place it upon her head. The silence that followed was absolute. Thousands of eyes locked onto the solitary figure in white at the base of the stairs. The entire kingdom held its collective breath, waiting for the final, crushing humiliation of the silver-haired woman. They waited for the inevitable tears, the trembling hands, the shattered pride. Aurelia did not move toward the golden pedestal. She did not reach for the velvet cushion. She remained perfectly still, her spine a rod of iron. I am the Luna of the Silverwood realm, Aurelia spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange acoustic resonance that penetrated the very souls of every lichen in the room. It was a voice tied to the roots of the earth itself, carrying the weight of ancient forests and deep subterranean stone. My authority is not granted by a royal decree. It is forged in the dirt, in the blood of our ancestors, and in the sacred truth of a fated bond. It is not something you can legislate away to satisfy a fleeting infatuation. Valerius frowned, the unease in his chest suddenly blooming into a sharp spike of warning. His internal beast growled, thrashing against his ribs, sensing a catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. The scent of rain and ozone, the precursor to a massive storm, began to roll off Aurelia's skin in suffocating waves. "Aurelia," he warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, rumbling threat. "Take the crown. Do not test my patience today. Do what is required of you for the stability of the pack." The Luna ignored him entirely. Her gaze swept over the horrified, captive audience of the nobility, forcing them to witness the unvarnished truth of their king's actions, before settling back on the man who had promised her eternity and delivered only betrayal. "A bond corrupted by deceit is no bond at all," she declared, her words slicing through the freezing air like freshly sharpened steel. "You believe you can cage my spirit, Valerius. You believe you can harvest the divine magic of my blood to anchor your throne, while offering the seat of honor to a shadow. You demand my submission." She took a single step up the dais. The frost radiating from her boots cracked loudly against the black marble. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous silence. "I give you my severance instead." Before the Alpha King could process the meaning of her words, Aurelia reached deep into the folds of her white gown. Her hand emerged, gripping the heavy rune-etched handles. The moment the sacred artifact was exposed to the open air, the faint blue light pulsing along its blades flared into a blinding, predatory brilliance. A collective scream of sheer, unadulterated terror erupted from the front rows of the nobility. They recognized the shears. Every educated lichen knew the terrifying mythology of the taboo weapon. The high priests and priestesses in the choir stalls dropped to their knees in absolute, horrified reverence. Valerius's storm-grey eyes widened to the size of coins. The blood drained instantly from his face, leaving him looking like a carved corpse. The absolute horror of realization slammed into him with the force of a falling mountain. He finally understood the magnitude of his arrogance. He had pushed the earth to its breaking point, and now it was going to swallow him whole. "No!" He roared, a primal, desperate sound that tore his vocal cords, shredding the dignified facade of the Alpha King. He lunged forward, throwing his massive body toward the edge of the dais, his hand outstretched to stop her, to pull her back from the precipice of absolute destruction. He was a fraction of a second too late. With a swift, brutally decisive motion, Aurelia reached back with her left hand, gathering the massive, heavy waterfall of her glowing silver hair into a single thick bind at the base of her neck. She brought the heavy, glowing blades up, positioning the razor-sharp, runic blades flush against the skin of her scalp. She did not flinch, she did not hesitate. The blades closed. The physical sound of the hair being severed echoed through the cathedral with the impossible volume of a cracking glacier. It was a noise that did not belong in the physical world, a metaphysical tearing that vibrated in the teeth and bones of everyone present. What followed was not merely a physical action. It was a metaphysical detonation. The moment the sacred silver severed the divine conduit, the golden thread connecting Aurelia's soul to Valerius's snapped. It did not merely break. It violently recoiled, whipping back into both of their chests with the force of a lightning strike. Aurelia gasped, her knees buckling slightly as a searing, white-hot agony exploded behind her sternum. It felt exactly as the ancient parchment had promised, as if a burning, jagged hook had been buried in her spine and violently ripped outward, taking a piece of her soul with it. Her vision flared white, and for a terrifying second she felt the abyss rushing up to consume her. But she bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, refusing to scream, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her pain. She channeled the agony, compressing it into a solid core of absolute resolve. She forced herself to remain standing. Her breathing was harsh, ragged, but she did not fall. She opened her hand. The massive, heavy locks of her radiant silver hair plummeted to the floor. They struck the black marble at the king's feet, immediately losing their divine luminescence, turning into dead, mundane strands of grey ash before they even settled. The shockwave hit the cathedral a microsecond later. An invisible wall of concussive, pure spiritual energy blasted outward from the severed conduit. It slammed into Valerius mid-lunge. The Alpha King was thrown backward as if struck by a massive, unseen battering ram. He crashed onto the stone floor, a sickening crunch echoing as his ceremonial armor dented against the dais. Valerius screamed. It was not a roar of anger, but a high, agonizing howl of absolute physical and spiritual devastation. He curled into a fetal position on the floor, clutching his chest, his fingers clawing frantically at his own breastplate, as if trying to dig out the burning shrapnel of the shattered mate bond. The magnificent, divine aura of the sovereign, the golden, protective light that had surrounded him for 7 years, visibly shattered. It cracked in the air like breaking glass and dissolved into nothingness, leaving him looking mundane, small, and utterly broken. The invincible king was suddenly nothing more than a bleeding, weeping man. The shockwave did not stop with the king. It ripped through the cathedral, a hurricane of freezing wind that blew out every candle and torch in the massive structure in a single, terrifying instant. The massive stained glass windows depicting the history of the realm exploded outward, raining shards of colored glass onto the screaming, panicking nobility below. The heavy oak pews splintered under the immense pressure. The banners bearing Valerius's crest ripped from their moorings and fluttered to the floor like dead leaves, symbols of a reign that had just been spiritually decapitated. Cynthia Thorne had been knocked flat on her back, her crimson velvet dress tangled around her legs, shrieking in mindless terror as the temperature in the room dropped to sub-zero levels. The gaudy golden headpiece had been blasted off its pedestal, rolling uselessly across the floor to clatter against the stone steps. Its emeralds cracked, its gold bent and tarnished by the sheer force of the magical backlash. Through the chaos, the screaming, and the swirling vortex of frost and shattered glass, Aurelia stood entirely unmoving. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving as she absorbed the traumatic shock of the amputation. But her spine remained perfectly, flawlessly straight. Her hair was gone, reduced to a jagged, chin-length crop that framed her pale, fiercely beautiful face. And then the shift occurred. Without the overwhelming weight of the silver conduit siphoning her energy to the Alpha, a new, entirely different kind of power began to pulse beneath her skin. It was not the cold, ethereal moonlight of the Luna, but an ancient, feral earth magic that belonged entirely to her. It surged up from the stone floor, rushing through her veins like a river of liquid silver. She could feel the heartbeat of the whispering woods miles away. She could sense the deep, subterranean roots of the continent. She was no longer just the mate of a king. She was a force of nature unchained. She looked down at the writhing, gasping form of the man she had once loved. The arrogant ruler who had thought he could command the heavens was now clawing at the stone floor, choking on his own ragged breaths as the reality of his severed power set in. The kingdom's magical barriers were already beginning to fracture, the wards tied to his aura unspooling in real time. He was losing everything. He watched her leave like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest, because that was exactly what she was, and because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. Aurelia did not offer a final word. She did not gloat. She did not demand an apology. She simply turned her back on the broken king, the screaming mistress, and the shattered cathedral. With the taboo relic still hanging loosely from her grip, dripping with the metaphysical blood of a murdered bond, the severed Luna walked back down the aisle. She stepped over the frozen wine, past the cowering bodies of the nobility who had so eagerly anticipated her downfall, and walked out of the capital into the absolute, liberated cold of the untamed north. For 3 days, the severed Luna had moved relentlessly northward. The journey away from the capital was a blur of biting frost and physical agony. Every step Aurelia took away from the great cathedral was accompanied by a vicious, phantom tug in her chest, the necrotized remnants of the golden thread fighting its own death. She had abandoned the smooth cobblestone roads of the inner territories, choosing instead to navigate the dense, untamed pine forests. Her once immaculate white silk gown was now stained with dark mud and rimed with ice, yet she wore it, with the unyielding posture of a sovereign marching to war. The cold seeped through the thin fabric, biting into her skin like 1,000 tiny daggers. The wind howled through the skeletal branches, whipping her ragged, chin-length hair against her freezing cheeks. She did not shiver, she did not stop to rest. The pain in her chest was a constant hollow ache, a cavernous void where the sacred bond had once pulsed with golden warmth. Now there was only the cold, hard truth of her isolation. But beneath that void, a new sensation was beginning to stir, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to echo from the frozen earth beneath her boots. It was her own magic, raw and untethered, waking from its long slumber. Every drop of blood in her veins recognized the untamed wilderness. She belonged to the earth, not to a throne of deceit. The jagged iron gates of the northern border loomed ahead. Beyond those rusted pillars lay the whispering woods, a vast, lawless expanse of neutral territory outside the jurisdiction of the throne. It was her salvation. The iron bars were thick with centuries of frost and neglect. For generations, the border crossing had been a symbol of exile, a one-way threshold for the unwanted, the banished, and the broken. Aurelia approached it not as a victim, but as a conqueror claiming her own freedom. Before she could cross the threshold, the ground beneath her boots began to vibrate. Aurelia stopped. The scent of lathered horses, polished steel, and desperate lichen aggression flooded the freezing air. Riding from the tree line behind her, a contingent of 20 elite royal cavalrymen thundered into the clearing, effectively cutting off her path to the border. Their massive war horses snorted plumes of white steam into the twilight, their hooves tearing up the frozen earth. The riders wore the heavy silver-plated armor of the inner guard, the crest of the Silverwood Alpha emblazoned on their chests. They were the king's hounds, sent to drag his prized possession back to her golden cage. At the head of the detachment, the captain of the guard pulled hard on his reins, forcing his mount to a jarring halt. He was a seasoned warrior, but as his eyes landed on the solitary figure of the silver-haired woman, a visible tremor of hesitation racked his frame. She was no longer glowing with the ethereal moonlight of a bonded mate, but a terrifying, feral earth magic seemed to roll off her skin in suffocating waves. The horses sensed it immediately. They danced backward, whinnying in primal panic, refusing to step within 10 yards of her. "Luna Aurelia," the captain called out, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a rigid bark of authority. "By the direct command of the sovereign, Valerius Silverwood, you are hereby ordered to halt. You are under arrest for high treason against the crown, the sabotage of the realm's magical wards, and the attempted assassination of the royal leader's spirit." Aurelia did not flinch. She slowly turned to face the cavalry. Her storm-glass grey eyes were entirely devoid of fear. There was only a vast, glacial emptiness. "I am no longer his Luna," she stated, her voice carrying a strange, acoustic resonance that made the nearby pine needles vibrate. "And a king who rules by deceit has no authority over the earth." The words hung in the freezing air, heavy with undeniable truth. The captain swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his sword hilt. He had served the crown for 2 decades, but he had never seen a power like this. A power that did not demand submission, but simply existed, ancient and absolute. The captain drew his broadsword. The rasp of steel against leather was deafening in the quiet clearing. "Do not force us to drag you back in chains, my lady. We have our orders." Before the soldiers could dismount, a blinding flash of silver-blue light erupted from the shadows of the rusted border gates. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a wooden staff striking stone echoed through the frozen clearing. High Priest Gideon stepped out of the freezing mist, his white and silver vestments billowing around his imposing frame. He had anticipated the king's frantic retaliation and bypassed the main roads to reach the border first. "Sheath your weapons, Captain," the older man roared. It was not the voice of a frail cleric, but the booming, terrifying command of a divine enforcer. The silver crescent moon atop his staff pulsed with a blinding, predatory luminescence. The captain blinked, clearly torn, between his secular orders and his deep-seated religious fear. "High Priest," the king commanded, "the king is a fool who has broken the foundational laws of this realm." Gideon interrupted, stepping squarely between Aurelia and the cavalry. He drove the base of his staff into the frozen earth. A shockwave of pure, suffocating spiritual pressure blasted outward. By the ancient laws of the celestial maker, a severed Luna is sacred and untouchable. Her body is a vessel of divine sacrifice. To lay a hostile hand upon her is to invite the absolute wrath of the heavens upon your own bloodline. The physical manifestation of the goddess's law was immediate and terrifying. The air pressure in the clearing plummeted. The massive war horses buckled to their knees, pinning their riders to the ground. The captain gasped, dropping his broadsword as an invisible crushing weight forced his forehead into the snow. The authority of the crown meant absolutely nothing in the face of ancient, divine mandate. Gideon turned his back on the groveling soldiers and looked at the woman in white. His deep-lined face softened with a mixture of profound sorrow and absolute respect. "The path is clear, Sovereign. Walk, and do not look back." Aurelia gave the high priest a single, slow nod of gratitude. She turned her back on the Silverwood realm, stepping past the rusted iron gates and crossing the boundary line into the absolute, liberated cold of the Whispering Woods. The neutral territory was a brutal, unforgiving landscape. Towering ancient spruces blocked out the moonlight, plunging the forest floor into a permanent, suffocating twilight. The wind here did not howl. It whispered, carrying the eerie, dissonant voices of forgotten spirits and feral predators. For hours, the exiled woman pushed herself deeper into the unknown, her body operating purely on adrenaline and sheer stubborn willpower. The silence of the neutral territory was heavy, pregnant with watching eyes. She could feel the gaze of the exiled, the outcasts who had made this frozen hell their home, tracking her every movement, but none approached her. The sheer intensity of her aura kept the feral beasts and the desperate rogues at bay. But the physical toll of the severance was immense. Without the protective warmth of the mate bond, the sub-zero temperature began to seep into her marrow. Her breathing grew shallow, her vision blurred at the edges, dissolving into a tunnel of grey static. She stumbled against the massive trunk of a fallen oak, her knees finally giving out. She collapsed into the deep snow, gasping for air. The freezing numbness was creeping up her extremities, threatening to pull her into the dark, seductive embrace of eternal sleep. Then she felt it. It was not the cold that jolted her awake. It was a sudden, fierce spike of heat originating from deep within her own body. Aurelia pressed her frozen, trembling fingers against the curve of her lower abdomen. Her breath hitched. A sudden, radiant bloom of warmth spread outward from her pelvis, a physical shudder that chased the frost from her veins. Her racing pulse caught, stuttered, and then synchronized with something completely separate from herself. Deep inside her womb, shielded by a newly awakened swirling cocoon of her raw earth magic, a second heartbeat fluttered. It was incredibly faint, a tiny, fragile rhythm fighting against the cold. But to her heightened lichen senses, it was as loud as a war drum. She closed her eyes, focusing her entire consciousness inward. The biological signature was unmistakable. It carried her own scent of rain and crushed leaves, intertwined with a faint, tragic echo of ozone and pine, the undeniable royal lineage of the Silverwood Alpha. A child. She was carrying Valerius's heir. She didn't know. During the chaos of the summit, during the agonizing days of her confinement, the stress had masked the early signs. The Alpha King, blinded by his toxic infatuation with his mistress, had been entirely oblivious to the life blooming right in front of him. He had cast aside not only his fated mate, but the very future of his bloodline. A profound, terrifying surge of protective fury exploded within her chest. The despair that had threatened to freeze her solid evaporated, replaced by a volcanic maternal instinct. She was no longer just a severed Luna seeking a place to die in peace. She was a mother, and she would tear apart the very fabric of the world before she allowed her child to be raised in a kingdom poisoned by deceit. "I will protect you," she whispered to the empty, freezing forest, her voice rough with unshed tears. "Not him, not them, you are mine. You shouldn't be making promises to the snow, little bird. It rarely keeps them." Aurelia's head snapped up. Stepping from the blinding white curtain of the blizzard was a massive, imposing figure. The man was gigantic, easily matching her former mate in height, but possessing a rugged, untamed breadth that spoke of a life spent surviving the harshest elements. He wore a cloak made from the pelt of a shadow bear, his face obscured by a thick, dark hood. As he stepped closer, the ambient magic of the ancient timberland seemed to part for him. His scent hit her, wood smoke, ancient earth, and the undeniable heavy authority of a rogue alpha. This was Rowan Blackwood, the undisputed leader of the exiled clans, a man who had forged a sanctuary for the outcasts and the forgotten. He looked down at the shivering, silver-haired woman in the ruined white gown. His sharp, amber eyes took in the ragged, chin-length crop of her hair, the terrifying pulse of her raw earth magic, and the fiercely protective way her hands curled over her abdomen. He did not see a broken victim. He saw a queen in exile. The stories of her public severance had already reached the outlands, whispered by the wind and the fleeing crows. Rowan had expected to find a weeping, shattered girl. Instead, he found a fierce, protective mother whose very presence commanded the ambient magic of the woods to bow. "The capital's loss is the forest's gain," Rowan rumbled, his voice surprisingly gentle despite his terrifying appearance. He dropped to one knee, offering his massive, calloused hand without crossing her personal boundary. "My camp is 3 miles north. There are fires, food, and people who do not care for the politics of arrogant kings. Will you accept sanctuary, sovereign?" Aurelia looked at the outstretched hand. It was not a demand, it was a choice. She placed her freezing fingers into his warm palm. "Take me there." Darkness claimed her then, absolute and heavy. When she finally opened her eyes, she was enveloped in the suffocating heat of thick firs beside a roaring hearth, the stinging bite of frost replaced by the deep, physical warmth of sanctuary. 3 months passed. The Whispering Woods, specifically the outland settlement governed by Rowan, underwent a miraculous transformation. Where there had once been only frozen dirt and struggling winter brush, vibrant life began to erupt. Aurelia's personal, innate magic, completely untethered from the oppressive weight of the Silverwood bond, flourished. She spent her days walking through the settlement, her mere presence causing dormant seeds to sprout. Green shoots pierced the thick snow. The exiled clans, who had survived on meager rations for years, now found themselves surrounded by an abundance of late winter harvests. The rogue wolves, once hardened and bitter from years of neglect, now bowed their heads when she passed. They built her a sanctuary, a massive, solid log cabin at the heart of the settlement, lined with the thickest firs and warmed by an eternal hearth. Rowan had ensured that no one questioned her past or demanded her name. To them, she was simply the sovereign, the silver-haired savior who had brought the sun back to their frozen world. She would spend her mornings walking among the frail, the sick, and the young pups of the clan. A single touch from her calloused fingertips was enough to mend broken bones and soothe feverish brows. She was no longer the silent, suffering figurehead of a corrupt court. The people of the outlands looked at her with genuine reverence, not because a king had ordered it, but because she had literally warmed their world. Her hair was beginning to grow back, shimmering with a new independent starlight aura, and beneath her simple, homespun tunics, the curve of her belly was growing undeniable. While the outlands thrived, the Silverwood capital was rotting from the inside out. Valerius Silverwood stood on the grand balcony of his throne room, staring down at the sprung farmlands that surrounded the citadel. His knuckles were white as he gripped the stone balustrade. The sight before him was a nightmare. The once lush, fertile fields of the realm were completely black. The crops had withered and died within weeks of his true mate's departure. The soil had turned to a dry, lifeless ash that crumbled in the wind. The magical barriers that protected the borders were flickering and failing, allowing packs of feral shadow beasts to ravage the outer villages. But the physical decay of the land was nothing compared to the devastation ravaging the king's own body. Valerius was a hollow shell of the magnificent alpha he had once been. Without the Luna's spiritual energy channeling the goddess's blessing into his soul, his supernatural strength was draining away. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his cheekbones. Dark, bruising circles shadowed his storm-grey eyes, the phantom pain in his chest. The empty crater where the golden thread had been violently ripped out was a constant, agonizing burn that no healer could soothe. He could feel the exact moment his strength began to ebb away. The sheer physical toll of ruling a dying land without a Luna's spiritual anchor was slowly pulling him into an early grave. He had thought he could cage her spirit. He had thought her hair would simply continue to power his reign while she sat quietly in the shadows. He had never imagined she possessed the sheer, terrifying willpower to amputate a piece of her own soul just to spite him. The grand wooden entryways of the throne room opened. High Priest Gideon entered, his face carved from unyielding stone. "You summoned me, my king," the priest said, his tone lacking any of the traditional reverence. The broken king turned, his movements stiff and sluggish. "The southern harvests have failed completely. The border wards in the east collapsed this morning. The warriors are reporting that their wounds are no longer healing." He took a ragged breath. "Where is she, Gideon?" "The Luna is exactly where she chose to be," the older man replied coldly. "Beyond your reach. She is my mate," Valerius roared, the sound echoing hollowly in the vast freezing room. He pounded a fist against the balustrade, but the impact only sent a shock of pain up his weakened arm. "She cannot just walk away and let my kingdom starve. I order you to use the scrying pools, track her magical signature, tell me where she is hiding." Gideon did not flinch. "I will not pervert the sacred arts to hunt down a woman who rightfully severed her bond to a traitor. Furthermore, her signature is no longer tied to this land. She has reclaimed her magic. It belongs only to her now." The priest paused, his eyes narrowing. Scouts returning from the northern borders speak of a strange phenomenon. They say the dead zones of the northern forests are blooming. They say the exiled clans have found a new sovereign, a woman with silver hair who walks the earth and brings spring in her wake. Valerius froze. The words hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. She was alive, she was thriving. While his kingdom crumbled into ash, she was breathing life into a wasteland. The catastrophic cost of his blindness finally, truly crashed down upon him. He had traded a goddess for a cheap imitation, and the earth itself was punishing him for it. "Prepare the royal carriage," the king whispered, his voice trembling with a desperate manic realization. "Assemble the elite guard. We ride for the Whispering Woods." "She will not return to you," Gideon warned, turning to leave. "A name unspoken for a season grows teeth, my king, and hers are meant to tear you apart." Deep within the shadowed corridors of the royal palace, Cynthia Thorne stood perfectly still, her back pressed against the cold stone wall outside the throne room. She held her breath, listening to the echoing footsteps of the high priest fading down the hall. Her hands were shaking. Her entire existence in the capital had become a living hell. The moment the silver locks had hit the cathedral floor, the mistress's victory had turned to ash. The ill-gotten diadem, which she had spent years manipulating her lover to obtain, sat tarnished and ignored on her vanity. The people of the territory despised her. The servants spat in her food. The nobility, who had eagerly supported her elevation when they thought it would bring them favor, now openly mocked her in the corridors. She possessed no magic. She could not heal the land. When she attempted to lead the traditional lunar prayers, the incense refused to burn. The sacred fires died instantly the moment she stepped onto the dais. The goddess herself was rejecting Cynthia's authority, and the entire pack could feel it. She was nothing but a useless, highly decorated parasite, and everyone knew it. The whispers behind her back grew louder with every passing day, the venomous gossip of court ladies eager to see her fall. But the true terror lay in Valerius's eyes. The Alpha King, who had once looked at her with burning infatuation, now barely registered her presence. He spent his nights pacing the floors, clutching his chest, whispering his ex-mate's name in a feverish, desperate litany. He was obsessed, and now she had just overheard the high priest confirm the worst. The exiled Luna was alive. She was thriving in the Whispering Woods. If Valerius found her, if he saw her power, he would drag her back. He would beg for her forgiveness on his knees. He would strip Cynthia of her title, her wealth, and cast her out to the wolves to appease the true queen. And worse, Cynthia had intercepted a whisper from a terrified northern scout just hours ago, a rumor spreading through the taverns of the border towns. The new sovereign of the Outlands was not only making the flowers bloom, she was heavy with child, an heir, Aurelia was carrying the true, biologically undeniable heir to the royal throne. A sickening wave of pure toxic jealousy clawed up Cynthia's throat. She could not allow it. She would not lose her crown to a woman she had already defeated. Pulling the hood of her velvet cloak over her face, the desperate woman slipped away from the throne room and navigated the labyrinthine servant passages that led to the underbelly of the capital's domain. The air grew damp and foul, smelling of rot and cheap ale. She descended into the lowest levels of the dungeon blocks, an area abandoned by the royal guards, and occupied only by the absolute dregs of lichen society. Waiting in the shadows of a dripping archway was a figure wrapped in dark leather. It was a rogue assassin, a mercenary who specialized in untraceable poisons and silent kills, banished from 3 different packs for unspeakable cruelty. Cynthia did not flinch at the stench of dried blood radiating from him. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a heavy velvet pouch filled with solid gold coins, stolen directly from the king's private treasury. Alongside the gold, she produced a folded piece of thick parchment, sealed with dark wax. "The target is in the Outlands territory," she hissed, her voice trembling with malice. She shoved the gold and the letter into the assassin's scarred hands. "Her name is Aurelia. She is heavily guarded by the exiled clans, led by Rowan Blackwood. You cannot fight them directly." The mercenary weighed the gold, a cruel smile stretching across his unseen face. "What is the method, my lady?" Cynthia's eyes gleamed with a venomous, desperate light. Inside that letter is a highly concentrated dose of nightshade and powdered silver, sealed with an archaic blood ward. It is completely undetectable until the seal is broken. Find a way to slip it into the Outlands camp. Make sure it reaches her hands. The moment she breaks the wax, the poison will absorb instantly through her skin. It will stop her heart, and the heart of the bastard she carries, before she even realizes she is dead. The assassin pocketed the contract, bowing mockingly. "Consider it done." Cynthia watched him disappear into the shadows. She leaned against the damp wall, her chest heaving as a twisted, frantic smile spread across her painted lips. Her rival had thought she could escape. She had thought she could steal the Alpha King's heir and live happily in the woods while the capital rotted. She didn't know how far a cornered rat go to protect its stolen cheese, and she definitely didn't know that death was already riding north. The sacred groves of this ancient sanctuary were a cathedral far older and far holier than anything built by lichen hands in the Silverwood realm. Here, there were no vaulted ceilings of petrified ironwood, trapping the suffocating heat of thousands of nobles, nor were there banners of silver and forest green demanding blind allegiance. There was only the towering canopy of ancient spruces, their branches weaving together to filter the midday sun into columns of soft golden light. The air was crisp, carrying the pristine, uncomplicated scent of untouched winter and deep subterranean stone. Aurelia Sterling walked barefoot across the damp emerald moss, her boots left at the edge of the grove. She had spent years walking the freezing, sterile corridors of the kingdom's grand cathedral, her bare feet stinging against petrified stone while the courtiers whispered cruel mockings behind her back. But here, the forest floor was alive, thrumming with an ancient, welcoming heartbeat that answered her every step. The sub-zero winter of the Outlands had completely surrendered to her presence in this sacred space. Where her toes pressed into the earth, vibrant green ferns uncoiled, and small luminous white moonflowers blossomed in her wake. She wore a simple, heavy woolen tunic dyed the color of crushed berries, the fabric stretching gently over the unmistakable, rounding curve of her abdomen. Her silver-white hair, once a massive, heavy waterfall that had anchored an empire's greed, now brushed just past her collarbones. It shimmered with a new, independent starlight aura that belonged to no one but herself. She was no longer a spiritual battery harnessed by a corrupt court. She was a mother, a sovereign, and a living extension of the earth itself. A few paces behind her, maintaining a respectful, deliberate distance, walked Rowan Blackwood. The towering rogue Alpha moved with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator, yet his presence was a source of profound, unshakable comfort. His scent, a rich, grounding blend of wood smoke, crushed pine, and ancient earth, wrapped around her like a physical shield. He never crowded her, he never demanded her submission, or attempted to control her magic. He simply watched her with eyes like molten gold, offering absolute protection without the suffocating cage of political expectations. Not used, not owned, chosen. That was the foundation of the sanctuary he had built for her. It was a silent promise, forged not by a biological curse, but by mutual reverence and earned trust. Aurelia paused, closing her eyes as she pressed her fingertips against the rough, freezing bark of a massive oak tree. She focused her consciousness inward, tuning out the rustle of the wind. Deep within her womb, she felt the tiny, frantic, yet impossibly strong second heartbeat fluttering in rhythm with her own. The child was thriving, wrapped safely in a warm, swirling cocoon of her raw earth magic. Suddenly, the ambient temperature of the grove plummeted by 10 degrees. The melodic bird song that had filled the canopy abruptly ceased, leaving a profound, unnatural vacuum of sound in its wake. Rowan's massive frame went entirely rigid. The warm golden hue of his eyes flared into a blinding predatory amber. The primal instinct thundered through his veins like a war drum. He didn't need to speak. The sudden spike of lethal tension radiating from his colossal body was all the warning Aurelia needed. A foul, metallic stench violently cut through the clean scent of the pine forest. It was the unmistakable, nauseating odor of dried blood, laced heavily with the acrid, chemical burn of highly concentrated nightshade. "Aurelia, move!" Rowan roared, his voice shattering the tranquil silence of the grove with the force of a physical blow. He lunged forward just as a terrifying, mechanical whistling tore through the canopy above them. Dropping from the dense shadows of the ancient spruces was a massive reinforced silver net. Its thick metal links were deeply etched with jagged, archaic runes, and it dripped with a viscous, liquid wolfsbane designed to instantly paralyze a lichen upon contact. The trap had been meticulously calculated, aimed directly at the exact spot where the pregnant Luna stood. Rowan threw his entire, gigantic body between Aurelia and the falling death. He intercepted the trap mid-air, allowing the heavy silver mesh to crash over his own broad shoulders instead of hers. The moment the runic metal made contact with his skin, it produced a sickening, violent hiss. Thick plumes of grey smoke erupted from his leather cloak and the bare flesh beneath. The rogue alpha let out a guttural, earth-shaking bellow of pure agony. As the silver seared mercilessly into his muscles, the wolfsbane immediately attempting to hijack his nervous system and shut down his heart. Yet he did not collapse. He went down on one knee, his mass-epiceps bulging, veins standing out on his neck like cords of steel as he gripped the searing net with his bare hands, desperately trying to tear the archaic metal apart, to shield her from whatever was coming next. From the dense underbrush directly behind the oak tree, the mercenary struck. The killer was a blur of dark leather and lethal intent. He did not draw a broadsword or a hunting dagger. He knew better than to engage a rogue alpha in direct combat, even a wounded one. His target was the woman. In his scarred, heavily gloved hand, he gripped a folded piece of thick parchment sealed with dark wax, the poisoned letter with archaic bloodward. It was Cynthia Thorne's ultimate masterstroke. The dark magic and contact poison, layered within the wax, required only a single fleeting brush against Aurelia's skin to trigger. It would stop her heart and the heart of the royal heir she carried, before she could even draw another panicked breath. "A gift from your old court, runaway," the mercenary hissed, closing the distance with terrifying, unnatural speed, thrusting the deadly parchment directly toward Aurelia's exposed throat. For a microsecond, the physical world seemed to freeze. Aurelia did not scream. She did not cower behind the agonizingly trapped rogue alpha. The sheer, unadulterated terror of the ambush was instantly swallowed by a volcanic eruption of maternal fury. She was a sovereign of the earth, and she would burn the entire forest down before she allowed the toxic rot of the Silverwood realm to touch her unborn child. She slammed both of her bare hands flat against the emerald moss of the forest floor. The response was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The earth beneath the mercenary's heavy boots exploded, the raw, untethered elemental magic surging through Aurelia's veins channeled directly into the soil. It did not feel like the cold, ethereal moonlight of the old mate bond. It felt like a river of boiling magma, ancient and infinitely powerful, vibrating with the collective, primal fury of the forest itself. With a deafening sound like a cracking glacier, massive jagged roots of petrified ironwood burst violently upward from the dirt. They were as thick as a man's torso, whipping through the freezing air with terrifying precision. Before the mercenary could even register the catastrophic shift in the magical atmosphere, the roots slammed into him, wrapping around his ankles, knees, and torso like a nest of enraged pythons. The killer shrieked in absolute terror as the roots violently hoisted him 3 feet into the air, completely immobilizing his limbs. He thrashed wildly, his hands clawing at the thick, unyielding bark that squeezed his lungs, but the ironwood only tightened its brutal hold in response to his panic. The poisoned letter slipped from his paralyzed grasp, tumbling through the air to land harmlessly on the damp moss, mere inches from Aurelia's bare toes. Aurelia rose to her feet, her steely gaze narrowing as she studied the emblem, glowing with a blinding starlight luminescence that cast stark, terrifying shadows across the grove. She raised her right hand, her fingers curling into a tight, deliberate fist. The ambient moisture in the air instantly froze. Sharp, lethal stalagmites of solid ice erupted from the overturned soil beneath the suspended man, encasing the killer's dangling legs and creeping rapidly up his chest, locking him in a cage of absolute zero frost. The horrific cracking of his ribs echoed through the silent grove as the ironwood roots tightened their crushing grip, squeezing the air from his lungs until his screams were reduced to pathetic, wet wheezes. His dark leather armor cracked under the immense pressure, the sound echoing sharply against the dense trunks of the ancient spruces. Aurelia did not blink. The woman who had once endured the court's cruelty in silence had been entirely forged anew by the fires of motherhood and survival. A heavy, metallic snap tore through the clearing. Rowan, fueled by a terrifying primal rage at seeing her threatened, had finally breached the limits of lichen endurance. With a deafening roar that shook the snow from the high branches, he forced his burning arms outward. The sheer physical force of his colossal strength shattered the runic silver net into dozens of smoking, twisted pieces. He stood up, his massive chest heaving, his breathing ragged, the sickening scent of his own burnt flesh filling the air. His molten gold eyes were fixed on the frozen killer, his lethal claws fully extended, ready to tear the incapacitated man into unrecognizable shreds. "Stop, Rowan," Aurelia commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a heavy, acoustic weight that immediately halted the rogue Alpha in his tracks. She stepped closer to the suspended, half-frozen killer, her face a mask of cold porcelain. "He is finished, and he has brought us exactly what we needed." The massive log cabin at the heart of the outland settlement was a sanctuary of heat and absolute physical safety. The roaring hearth at the center of the main room cast a warm, flickering orange glow against the thick firs lining the walls, aggressively pushing back the biting winter cold that ruled outside the sturdy timber entrance. The air inside was thick with the comforting, earthy scents of burning pine, dried lavender, and the sharp, medicinal tang of crushed moon sage. Rowan sat on a low wooden bench near the fire, his broad back entirely exposed to the ambient heat. The runic silver net had left horrific, deep, searing burns across his shoulders and the thick musculature of his torso. The skin was violently blistered, the edges of the wounds blackened and smelling faintly of ozone and charred flesh. The magical suppression woven into the silver was actively fighting his lichen biology, turning what should have been a quick regenerative process into a grueling, agonizing ordeal. Despite the excruciating pain that would have rendered a lesser warrior unconscious, the giant rogue Alpha remained perfectly still. His jaw was clenched tight, his breathing slow and intensely measured, so as not to disturb the woman working quietly behind him. Aurelia stood close to his back, the sleeves of her tunic rolled up past her elbows. Her hands, which only an hour ago had glowed with the terrifying force of destructive elemental magic, were now moving with exquisite, painstaking gentleness. She dipped a clean linen cloth into a wooden bowl filled with a thick cooling poultice made from aloe, ground limestone, and her own concentrated healing earth magic. The contrast between the violent destruction in the grove and the tender precision of her touch was profound. As she pressed the freezing poultice against the worst of the chemical burns, Rowan let out a low, involuntary hiss, the massive muscles of his back flinching instinctively. "I know," Aurelia murmured, her voice a soft, acoustic hum that carried the soothing resonance of a calm river. She leaned closer, the warmth of her breath brushing against his uninjured shoulder. Her magic flowed effortlessly now. There were no restrictive wards, no high priests muttering archaic prayers to channel her power away. It belonged solely to her. The cooling earth energy seeped into his brutalized flesh, fighting back the vicious sting of the wolfsbane. She allowed a slow, controlled pulse of her innate magic to flow through her fingertips, systematically numbing the damaged nerve endings and drawing the toxic remnants out of his bloodstream. The silver was laced with archaic runes designed to prevent accelerated cellular healing. It will take time to close completely, but the infection is already fading. Rowan exhaled slowly, the rigid tension leaving his colossal frame as her magic went to work. The physical closeness between them in the quiet cabin was undeniable, a heavy, gravitational pull built on shared survival and absolute trust. He had thrown himself blindly into a lethal trap simply to ensure a single scratch did not touch her or the child she carried. It was a profound, staggering contrast to the man who had supposedly been fated to her soul, the man who had publicly sacrificed her dignity for political convenience. Some wounds could only be healed with absolute devotion, she realized, as her thumbs gently smoothed the linen bandages over his scarred skin. The golden thread of connection intertwining their auras felt completely natural, completely free of any demanding expectations. When the last of the bandages was securely fastened, Aurelia stepped back, wiping her hands on a damp towel. She turned her attention to the heavy, scarred oak table sitting in the center of the room. Resting on the dark wood, isolated like a venomous snake preparing to strike, was the evidence retrieved from the frozen mercenary. There was the folded parchment, sealed with a dark, almost black wax. Even from a distance of 2 feet, Aurelia could feel the sickening, malevolent radiation of the magic woven deeply into it. Beside the letter lay a square of boiled leather, violently ripped from the killer's armor before he had died from the crushing pressure of the ironwood roots. Aurelia stepped closer, her piercing pale irises locking onto Rowan's. It was a mercenary's mark, a crude, terrifying depiction of a serpent coiled tightly around a silver dagger. It was the hallmark of the deepest, most corrupt criminal syndicate operating within the capital's underbelly. These were not men who worked for political ideals or pack loyalty. They were ruthless butchers who worked strictly for exorbitant amounts of untraceable gold. "Nightshade and powdered silver," Aurelia stated, her voice dropping to a frigid, clinical whisper as she analyzed the aura of the unbroken wax seal. She did not dare touch the deadly object with her bare skin. "It is an archaic blood ward. The poison is suspended perfectly within the wax itself. The moment a target breaks the seal, the toxin absorbs instantly through the pores. It causes catastrophic cardiac arrest within seconds. It is a coward's weapon, untraceable, silent, and absolute." Rowan stood up from the wooden bench, carefully pulling a clean, oversized linen shirt over his heavily bandaged shoulders. He walked to the table, his molten gold eyes staring down at the deadly parchment with a terrifying, homicidal hatred. A common street mercenary does not possess the resources or the knowledge to commission an archaic blood ward, he rumbled, his voice vibrating deep within his broad chest, and they do not target exiled lunars on a whim. This hit was paid for with royal gold from the inner vaults. "It was Cynthia," Aurelia replied, the name leaving her lips like a filthy curse. The puzzle pieces locked together in her mind with sickening, undeniable clarity. The mistress had won the crown, but she had inherited a rapidly dying kingdom. With the realm's crops failing and the magical barriers collapsing because of the severed bond, the false consort was desperate. She knows Valerius is rapidly losing his grip on the pack. She knows the people are realizing her title is a hollow sham, and she must have heard the rumors reaching the border towns. Rumors that the true heir to the royal throne is growing safe in the distant timberlands. She sent death to ensure my child never draws breath. Rowan's jaw clenched so hard the bone popped audibly in the quiet room. He turned to face her, his expression grim and perfectly lethal. The mercenary is dead, but the threat is not over. Aurelia, my border scouts returned an hour ago while you were resting. They brought urgent news from the southern snow ridge. Aurelia looked up, her pulse quickening slightly beneath her calm exterior. What news? A massive royal procession has crossed the boundary line into our sanctuary, Rowan revealed, his tone heavy with impending violence. Alpha King Valerius is leading them personally. He travels with his entire elite inner guard and half of his terrified political council. The scouts say he looks like a walking corpse. His aura is completely shattered, and his men are exhausted from fighting off the feral shadow beasts that have breached his failing borders. He is tracking the massive bloom of your earth magic. He is coming here, Aurelia. He is coming to beg you to return and save his rotting empire. The heavy words hung in the warm air of the cabin, battling against the crackling heat of the hearth. For a long moment, the only sound was the popping of the burning pine logs. The revelation that her former mate was finally at her doorstep did not bring a wave of nostalgic grief or a flicker of hesitation. Instead, a cold, crystalline resolve hardened in Aurelia's chest. Rowan took a deliberate step closer, closing the physical distance between them. He looked down at her, his amber eyes filled with a fierce, unyielding protectiveness that demanded nothing but offered everything. Give the word, Sovereign. We can mobilize the exiled clans within the hour. I can take you deep into the northern mountains, to a hidden sanctuary where his dying magic can never track you. Or, if you wish it, I will stand at the border of this settlement and slaughter every single royal guard that steps foot on this soil. I would rather burn with you than freeze alone in the aftermath of his absolute arrogance. Aurelia looked at the towering, scarred man who offered to bleed for her, to fight an entire army for her, without demanding a single compromise of her freedom. Then she looked back down at the mercenary's mark and the poisoned letter radiating its dark, lethal intent upon the wooden table. She placed a protective, instinctual hand over the curve of her belly, feeling the steady, reassuring thud of the second heartbeat. For 7 years, she had played the role of the silent, enduring Luna. She had kept her head bowed and her spine straight while the court mocked her. She had accepted public humiliation and exile with a dignified curtsy, believing that walking away and leaving them to their own ruin was the ultimate victory. But Cynthia's cowardice had violently changed the rules of engagement. They had not just insulted her pride, they had tried to murder her unborn child. No, Aurelia whispered, the single word echoing with the terrifying acoustic weight of a shifting tectonic plate. She lifted her chin, her unwavering focus locking onto the shivering, mud-soaked figure she knew would soon be arriving. The glacial emptiness that had once haunted her gaze was entirely gone, replaced by the blazing, unstoppable inferno of a true queen who had finally realized her own absolute worth. We will not run, and we will not hide like prey in the mountains. Rowan's eyebrows furrowed slightly, though his posture remained utterly supportive and ready for war. What is your command? We will prepare the outlands, Aurelia declared, her voice ringing with absolute, sovereign authority. Let the Alpha King come. Let him march his exhausted guards and his desperate council right into the heart of this settlement. When Valerius arrives to drop to his knees in the dirt and beg for his salvation, he will not find a runaway wife. He will find the sovereign of the Whispering Woods waiting for him in the harsh light of day. She reached out, picking up the piece of boiled leather, bearing the mercenary's mark, using a pair of heavy iron tongs from the hearth, dropping the emblem onto a silver platter right next to the poisoned letter. She believed I would die quietly in the shadows, but I will not wear the heavy, suffocating silks they forced upon me during the coronation ever again. I will wear the colors of the earth and the undeniable aura of a mother protecting her child. Aurelia continued, her tone dropping to a lethal, promises-laced purr that sent a shiver of anticipation down Rowan's spine. And when he stands before his own people, completely broken and desperate, I will present this irrefutable evidence to his own elite guard. I will publicly unmask the sovereign consort as a treacherous murderer who attempted to assassinate the true heir to the throne. I will force Valerius to realize that the woman he destroyed his entire kingdom for is nothing but a venomous, cowardly rat. He will see the absolute devastation of his own choices staring back at him in the unyielding light of day. We will not just reject him, Rowan. We will utterly obliterate what is left of his reign." The rogue Alpha stared at her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his rugged, scarred face. His chest rumbled with a deep, approving growl of pure satisfaction. He bowed his head, a gesture of absolute respect that he had never offered to any other monarch. The trap was flawlessly set. The blind Alpha King was riding straight into his own public execution, and neither he nor his mistress had any idea that the blade was already falling. The vanguard of the Silverwood procession breached the inner boundary of the Outlands just as the sun reached its zenith. What was meant to be a grand royal expedition to reclaim a runaway wife looked more like a funeral march of the damned. The elite inner guard, once the pride of the Lycan Empire, dragged their boots through the slush, their silver-plated armor tarnished and caked with the freezing mud of the Whispering Woods. They had spent weeks fighting off feral shadow beasts that had effortlessly slipped through the capital's failing magical barriers. Their war horses were emaciated, their heads hanging low, their breath pluming in weak, ragged gasps. At the center of the exhausted column rode Alpha King Valerius. The man who had once commanded the heavens from his petrified ironwood throne was entirely unrecognizable. He sat slumped in his saddle, his broad shoulders hunched inward, as if trying to protect a gaping chest wound that no one else could see. Without the divine conduit of his true mate's hair anchoring his soul to the moon goddess, his supernatural vitality had evaporated. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched terrifyingly tight over his cheekbones. His storm-glass grey eyes, once crackling with absolute authority, were sunken and bloodshot, darting wildly around the thriving forest, as if the vibrant green ferns and blossoming moonflowers were a personal insult to his decaying existence. The phantom agony of the violently shattered mate bond had hollowed him out from the inside. Trailing reluctantly behind his royal mount was a heavy, gilded carriage. Inside it, wrapped in layers of stolen mink and desperately clutching the tarnished emerald circlet, sat Cynthia Thorne. She had refused to stay behind in the crumbling capital, terrified that the starving citizens would tear her apart the moment the king's protection was out of sight. As the procession crested the final snow-covered ridge, the dense tree line broke, revealing the heart of the outland settlement. The political council of Silverwood, riding alongside their broken monarch, collectively pulled on their reins, gasping in sheer, unadulterated shock. They had expected to find a miserable clump of starving exiles shivering in the dark. Instead, they found a sprawling, thriving sanctuary. Massive log cabins with roaring stone chimneys formed a protective ring around a central plaza. The snow here had melted entirely, replaced by lush, emerald moss and vibrant winter-blooming flora. The air did not smell of death and ash like the capital. It was thick with the scent of roasted venison, fresh cedar and the undeniable, thrumming pulse of raw earth magic. But it was not the architecture that made the Silverwood guards instinctively reach for their hilts. It was the welcoming committee. Gathered shoulder to shoulder in a massive unbroken crescent formation were hundreds of exiled rogue wolves. They did not wear polished armor or carry ceremonial banners. They wore heavy furs and boiled leather, their faces scarred from years of brutal survival. They stood in absolute, terrifying silence. There was no chaotic snarling, no breaking of ranks. It was a display of lethal discipline that dwarfed the king's exhausted guard. Stationed dead center at the front of the blockade was Rowan Blackwood. The towering rogue Alpha wore a clean linen shirt that stretched tight over the fresh, thick bandages wrapping his torso, a brutal reminder of the archaic silver net he had intercepted just hours ago. He held no weapon, yet his mere presence radiated an overwhelming predatory heat. His molten gold eyes locked onto the advancing Alpha King with a mixture of profound pity and absolute, homicidal promise. "Halt your advance, Silverwood," Rowan's voice boomed across the clearing. The acoustic weight of his command vibrated through the damp earth, causing the exhausted royal warhorses to instinctively take a step backward. "You have crossed into sovereign territory. State your business, or turn your rotting procession around and march back into the snow." Valerius slid from his saddle. His legs wobbled violently upon hitting the ground, the impact sending a visible tremor of weakness up his spine. The elite guards instantly moved to support him, but he waved them off with a desperate, frantic snarl. He stumbled forward, ignoring the massive rogue Alpha entirely, his hollow eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors of the central sanctuary behind the defensive line. "I have not come for war," Valerius rasped. His voice, once a thundering instrument of absolute dominance, cracked pathetically. "I have come for my wife. I have come for the Luna of the realm. The Luna of your fallen kingdom died on the floor of your great cathedral." A voice answered. The formidable wooden thresholds of the central sanctuary swung open. The sound was not loud, but it possessed a strange, resonant finality that cut through the murmur of the royal council like a blade through silk. The wall of exiled warriors parted instantly, bowing their heads in unified absolute reverence. Aurelia stepped out into the midday sun. She did not wear the midnight blue crest of her former house, nor did she wear the blinding white silk of ceremonial mourning. She wore a heavy, sweeping gown dyed the deep, vibrant color of crushed berries, the fabric interlaced with subtle threads of woven ironwood bark. Her hair, which Valerius had so arrogantly believed he owned, was no longer a massive, heavy waterfall. It was cropped to her collarbones, yet it shimmered with a blinding, independent starlight aura that seemed to illuminate the entire plaza. Balanced upon her brow was a simple, elegant circlet woven from living green vines and luminous white moonflowers, but it was not the crown that made Valerius's heart stop completely. It was the undeniable, rounding curve of her abdomen. The king froze, his boots sinking into the damp earth, his dilated pupils locked onto her belly. Suddenly, the wind shifted, carrying her scent across the clearing. Beneath the crisp aroma of rain and earth magic was a second biological signature. It was a faint, tragic echo of ozone and pine. The Alpha King dropped to his knees in the dirt. The heavy clatter of his tarnished armor, striking the stone path, echoed through the absolute silence of the clearing. The terrifying, undeniable reality of his own catastrophic blindness crashed down upon him. She was carrying his child, a true heir. A child conceived in the final days of their bond, a child he had completely overlooked while he was busy parading a manipulative impostor in front of his court. "Aurelia," Valerius choked out. Tears, hot and desperate, spilled over his sunken cheeks, carving tracks through the grime on his face. He crawled forward a single pace, his trembling hands reaching out toward her, fingers clawing at the empty air. The terrifying sovereign who had stripped her of her dignity had been reduced to a weeping, groveling beggar. Goddess! Aurelia! "I swear on my life, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you chose not to look, Valerius," she replied. Her voice was steady, completely devoid of any tremble or nostalgic sorrow. She looked down at him with a vast, glacial emptiness. "You were too blinded by the glare of a cheap emerald crown to see the gold you were throwing into the fire." "I was wrong," he screamed, the sound tearing his throat. The king placed his hands flat in the mud, bowing his head so low his forehead touched her boots. He did not care that his entire political council was watching him humiliate himself. He did not care about the crown. He was a dying man begging for water in a desert. "The magic is gone. The crops have turned to ash. The wards are broken. I am broken, Aurelia. The thread. The empty space where you used to be. It is burning me alive from the inside out." He lifted his face, his expression twisted in raw, unadulterated agony. "Please, come back. I will give you everything. I will strip Cynthia of all titles. I will banish her to the frozen wastes today. I will build you a new cathedral. I will get on my knees before the entire pack and declare you the sole absolute ruler of Silverwood. Just come home. Please, my mate, let me protect our child." From the back of the procession, the gilded carriage door burst open. Cynthia stumbled out into the mud, her crimson velvet cloak dragging through the slush. Her face was pale with sheer panic, the heavy layers of imported rosewater unable to mask the sudden sour stench of her absolute terror. "Valerius, no!" Cynthia shrieked, scrambling past the horrified council members, her hands grasping desperately at the king's armored shoulder. "You promised me. You made me the sovereign consort. You cannot cast me aside for this feral exile." Valerius violently shoved her backward with the back of his armored hand. Cynthia hit the mud with a wet thud, the cursed golden tiara slipping from her grasp and rolling uselessly into a puddle of dirty water. "Shut your mouth," he snarled at her, his voice vibrating with sudden venomous hatred. He turned back to Aurelia, his eyes pleading. "Do you see? I reject her. I reject her completely. It is only you, Aurelia. It has always been you." Aurelia did not flinch at his pathetic display of violence. She simply stared at the man she had once loved, feeling absolutely nothing. The phantom ache in her chest that had tortured her for months was gone, replaced by a solid, unyielding core of sovereign peace. "You offer me the ashes of a kingdom you burned yourself," Aurelia said softly, her words carrying the heavy acoustic resonance of a falling guillotine. "And you promised to protect my child from the very monsters you invited into your bed." She raised her left hand, a single, deliberate gesture. Rowan stepped forward from the line of rogue warriors. In his massive hands, he carried a polished silver platter. Placed upon the gleaming metal was a piece of boiled leather bearing a crude, terrifying emblem. A serpent coiled tightly around a silver dagger. Beside it lay a folded piece of thick parchment, its dark wax seal unbroken, radiating a sickening, malevolent aura of dark magic. The captain of the Silverwood Guard, positioned a few paces behind the kneeling king, suddenly stiffened. The color drained entirely from the veteran warrior's face. He recognized the mercenary's mark immediately. It was the hallmark of the deepest, most corrupt criminal syndicate operating within the capital's underbelly. "What is this?" Valerius whispered, his hollow eyes shifting from Aurelia to the silver platter. "This is the reality of the woman you elevated to my equal," Aurelia declared, her voice ringing out so every single member of the terrified political council could hear the absolute truth. She pointed to the dark, sealed parchment, an archaic blood ward, a highly concentrated dose of nightshade and powdered silver, suspended perfectly within the wax, designed to kill upon contact. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the Silverwood elite. Aurelia stepped around the kneeling king, her storm-glass grey eyes locking onto the shivering, mud-soaked figure of the mistress. 2 hours ago, an assassin breached this sacred grove. He brought this gift, paid for with royal gold from your own inner vaults. She knew your kingdom was dying, Valerius. She knew you were losing your grip on the throne. And when she heard the rumors that I was carrying the true heir to the realm, she sent a mercenary to ensure my child's heart stopped beating before he ever drew breath. Valerius stopped breathing. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked at the poisoned letter, feeling the dark, lethal intent radiating from the wax, and then slowly turned his head to look at Cynthia. The false consort was scrambling backward in the mud, shaking her head frantically. "Lies!" she screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. "She is framing me. I never left the capital. Valerius, you must believe me. It is a trick of her earth magic. The assassin's body is currently frozen in a cage of solid ice a mile from here," Rowan rumbled, his voice dropping to a lethal, promises-laced purr. He pulled back the collar of his linen shirt, exposing the horrific, fresh, blackened burns across his collarbone caused by the runic silver net. He triggered a wolfsbane trap before attempting to thrust that letter against her throat. "If you doubt the sovereign's word, I invite you to examine the corpse. Or I can force the false consort to break the wax seal herself right now, and we can all watch how quickly her heart stops." Cynthia clamped her hands over her mouth, a terrified sob escaping her lips as she violently scrambled away from the silver platter. Her sheer, animalistic terror at the sight of the dark wax was the only confession the council needed. Valerius stared at the woman he had destroyed his entire life for. The ruinous weight of his own decisions pressed down upon him under the cold, unyielding light of day. He had sacrificed the divine blessing of the lunar sovereign, starved his people, and shattered his own soul for a manipulative, cowardly rat who had tried to murder his unborn child. A primal, blood-curdling roar of pure agony tore from the Alpha King's throat. He lunged across the mud, his armored hands locking around Cynthia's throat before the guards could even flinch. He pinned her into the freezing slush, his storm-grey eyes completely vacant of sanity, consumed by the absolute catastrophic realization of his own ruin. "Treason!" the captain of the guard bellowed, drawing his broadsword as the remaining council members shouted in sheer panic, ordering the royal guards to secure the screaming mistress before the king snapped her neck in a blind rage. It took 4 elite warriors to pry Valerius off her, dragging the hysterical, thrashing Cynthia away toward the carriages to await execution for high treason. Valerius collapsed back into the mud, his chest heaving, his face buried in his dirty hands. He was weeping openly, a broken, pathetic shell of a monarch. "Aurelia," he sobbed, reaching blindly for the hem of her berry-coloured gown. "Please, I was blind. I was poisoned by my pride. I have executed justice. The threat is gone. I will spend the rest of my life grovelling at your feet to earn your forgiveness. I am nothing without you. The pack is nothing without you. You are my true mate." Aurelia stepped back, pulling the fabric of her gown smoothly out of his desperate reach. She looked at the broken man in the mud. She felt no pity. She felt no triumph in his pain. She only felt the profound, unshakable certainty of her own freedom. The bonding ceremony was supposed to be the beginning of everything, Aurelia said softly, her voice carrying across the silent, breathless clearing. "But the golden thread is gone, Valerius. I severed it the moment I cut my hair. There is nothing left for you to claim. I am your alpha," he cried out, a pathetic, dying gasp of his former authority. "You are the ruler of a graveyard," Aurelia corrected him, her spine flawlessly straight. "I have built my own kingdom in the snow. My magic belongs to the earth, my child belongs to the outlands, and my heart belongs entirely to myself." She reached out, placing her hand gently against Rowan's heavily bandaged arm. The massive rogue alpha leaned slightly into her touch, his molten gold eyes completely soft as he looked down at her. "Not used, not owned. Chosen," Aurelia stated, turning her gaze back to the king one final time. "Take your dying procession and leave my forest. If a single Silverwood soldier ever crosses the boundary line again, the earth will swallow them whole. That is the decree of the sovereign of the northern wilds." Valerius Silverwood stared up at her. He saw the magnificent, blinding aura of a queen who had survived his cruelty and flourished in the aftermath. He realized, with a final, crushing finality, that he had never truly deserved her. He had stepped onto the throne believing he was a god, but she was the earth that held it up, and she had simply moved on. Aurelia did not wait to watch the royal guards drag their weeping king back to his emaciated horse. She did not stay to watch the procession turn around in absolute disgrace. She simply turned her back on the Silverwood realm forever. With Rowan matching her stride, his massive frame acting as an unbreakable shield against the dying past, she walked back into the warmth of the central log cabin. The thick timber portals closed behind them, shutting out the cold, the betrayal, and the ghosts of a broken bond once and for all. Spring arrived in the outlands with a brilliant, explosive burst of colour. The deep snows melted away, revealing a valley blanketed in wild emerald ferns, blossoming moonflowers, and the crisp, clean scent of fresh pine. Inside the massive log cabin, the heavy furs had been pulled back to let the warm sunlight stream across the polished wooden floor. Aurelia sat in a comfortable rocking chair carved from smooth ironwood, bathed in the golden afternoon light. Cradled gently against her chest, wrapped in a blanket of soft spun wool, was a healthy, quietly sleeping infant boy. He possessed a thick tuft of silver-white hair, exactly like his mother's, and when he opened his eyes, they were the colour of a clear, unclouded storm. But he would never know the cold stone of the great cathedral. He would never know the suffocating weight of an arrogant empire. Heavy, silent footsteps approached from behind the chair. Rowan knelt beside her, his massive, scarred hand reaching out with exquisite gentleness to brush a stray curl from the sleeping baby's forehead. The child let out a soft, contented sigh, instinctively leaning his tiny cheek against the rogue alpha's calloused thumb. Some wounds could only be healed with absolute devotion. Rowan had built this sanctuary with his bare hands, shielding them from the darkness until the light returned. He was not tied to them by a biological curse or a political treaty. He was tied to them by choice. Aurelia leaned her head against Rowan's broad shoulder, closing her eyes as the scent of wood smoke and cedar enveloped her. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy in the face of a kingdom's cruelty. She would never step aside again. She was the sovereign of her own destiny, and she was finally home. Thank you for walking through the dark with me until the very end. The Luna who accepted public humiliation, the king who learned to crawl in the dirt, and the quiet strength that proved more powerful than any crown. If you enjoyed this journey of retribution and healing, let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Did the king grovel enough for your satisfaction, or did he get off too easy? Your thoughts mean more than you know. Subscribe to join our sanctuary for more stories of true mates, unbreakable dignity, and absolute devotion. Until next time, stay safe and remember your worth.